Chafav, chapter 26, Pasuk Aleph, verse 1. It shall be when you come to the land that Hashem your God gives you as an inheritance. V'yirishta, you shall take possession of it. V'yashavta and settle in it. V'lakachta mereishis kol pri adama, you shall take from the first of all the fruits of the land. Asher tavim me'artzecha, that you shall bring forth from your land. Asher Hashem Elokecha noisen lach, that Hashem your God gives you. V'samta b'atena, and you shall place it in a basket. V'alachta l'makayim, you shall then go to the place Hashivcha Hashem Elokecha, that Hashem your God will choose l'shakein shem Hasham, to dwell His name there. So here the Torah is telling us that after Eretz Yisrael is settled, conquered and settled, we have a mitzvah to bring from the first of the produce of our land. This mitzvah is what we call bikurim. Bikurim from the word ripen. The first ripened fruits are what we are going to bring, we are going to take them, set them aside as bikurim, and we're going to place them in a basket and bring them to the place where Hashem chooses, which means the Beis Hamikdash, to the Holy Temple. You shall come to the Kohen that will be in those days. V'yamar to Elav, and you'll say to him, Higadati hayom Hashem Elokecha, I declare today to Hashem your God. Now, it's not just the Kohen's God, it's everybody's God. But when you say to someone, when you're talking to a specific person, and you say your God, that's a very honorable way of addressing a person. You're telling the person your God means you have a special relationship with him. You have a unique relationship with Hashem. So when we speak to the Kohen, we say, Higadati hayom Hashem Elokecha, I declare today to Hashem your God. Kivasi elo aretz, I have come to the land. Asher nishba Hashem la'ava, Yisenu l'saslanu, that Hashem has sworn to our forefathers to give to us. Lokach hakohen atenu miyadecha, the Kohen then takes the basket. V'neichai l'fnei mizbach Hashem Elokecha, and he places it before the mizbeach of Hashem your God, before the altar of Hashem your God. V'anisa v'amarta l'fnei Hashem Elokecha, you'll then raise your voice and say before Hashem your God, Arami Ovid Avi, Lavan of Aram wanted to destroy my father. Vayered Mitzrayim, went down to Mitzrayim. I'm not going to read through all these psukim. All these psukim are where the person bringing Bikurim goes through a short synopsis of the history of the Jewish people, of how Hashem saved them from Lavan. They went to Mitzrayim. They were enslaved in Mitzrayim. Hashem did miracles to save them. And eventually Hashem has now brought us to the land that is flowing with milk and honey. Pasuk Yud, verse 10 then reads, and now, behold, I bring the first of the fruits of the land, Asher nasata li Hashem, that you have given me, Hashem. So the person who brings the Bikurim, these fruits, he expresses his gratitude to Hashem, and he doesn't just say, thank you for the fruits, which is the last verse, but rather this is a point of time where the person kind of goes through a short synopsis of Jewish history, of thanking Hashem for saving us and bringing us to this point. And now I have these fruits that I have brought before you, Hashem, and I thank you for them. Okay, we're going to focus now on going back to Pasuk Gimel, verse 3. You shall come to the Kohen that will be in those days. Obvious question. You can't bring the Bikurim to any other Kohen than the one who's in those days. You can't bring it to a Kohen from the past. You can't bring it to a Kohen from the future. It's got to be a Kohen of the present. So why is the Torah saying, and you'll bring it to the Kohen that will be in those days? Of course it's from those days. What other days could it be? So Rashi comments on these words of that will be in your days. All you have is the Kohen in your days as he is. Now, what Rashi here means is something similar to what he says in the previous Parsha, when it talks about speaking to the sages or the elders, when you have a question, that it's the elder. There, the Torah also says the elders that will be at those days. Now, again, what other days could they be from? And the answer is, and that's the idea behind Rashi here too, is that a person may look at the present, either elders, rabbis, Kohanim, and say, I remember when Kohanim were, big tzaddikim. I remember Kohanim were very special people. I remember the rabbis from the previous generation, how great they were. And now what we have now is nothing in comparison to what we had before. And because of that, you may feel discouraged from asking them the questions, dealing with them. And therefore the Torah says you bring it to the Kohen of those days. Whoever the Kohen is, that's who you bring it to. You deal with those who you have now. It may be true that the ones from previous generations were greater, but that's not relevant. You deal with who you have now. Whether it's the rabbis of these generations, whether it's the Kohen of these generations, you deal with the ones in those days. The fact that they're not like the ones from previous days should not be any kind of a reason to discourage you from using them or for possibly using them wholeheartedly. Now, the Ramban asks on Rashi, Nachmanides asks on Rashi, a very obvious question. When you're talking about elders and rabbis, and you're dealing with their scholarship and what kind of people they were that would add to their ability to answer your questions, okay, so then a person could say, the rabbis nowadays are not like the rabbis of the previous generations. Are they really worthy of answering my questions? Can they really answer the big questions that we have? And the Torah says that even if they may not be as great, they are the ones who you ask. But as we say, the havamina, the thought process, what you're thinking about not using them or not respecting them, if you're dealing with rabbis or elders, it makes sense. If the previous rabbis were greater than the present rabbis, then there is a possibility to say, okay, so I'm going to ask my questions to them. They're not such great scholars as the ones from before. They're not going to be able to answer my questions. Why should I ask them? And the Torah says, no, you speak to the rabbis, the elders of your times. They are the ones that are the leaders. They are the ones that Hashem helps, and you can ask them your questions, and you should. But when we're talking about a Kohen here, right, what's the difference if the Kohen is from the great generation or from a smaller generation? He's a Kohen. What's he doing here? You're giving him the bikurim, giving him the fruits, and he takes the fruits from you. He eventually eats the fruits. What's the difference at what kind of spiritual level he may be at? At the end of the day, he's a Kohen. At the end of the day, he has to perform. He performs what needs to be performed. So why would you think that just because the Kohen from these days is not as great, is not as spiritually great as the previous Kohanim, that's a reason not to give them the Bikurim, for some reason not to deal with them? What's the difference? What level the Kohen is at? If you're talking about a scholar, okay, a scholar, if one was a greater scholar than the present scholars, okay, then you may think, oh, so why should I ask them my questions? They're not as scholarly. No, the Torah says you ask them anyway. But a Kohen is a Kohen. He does the service. What's the difference whether he's as great as the previous Kohanim or not? That's the Ramban's question. That's Nachmanides' questions on Rashi. So therefore, Ramban himself has a different explanation. And his explanation he cites from the Sifri, from the Medrash Sifri. Now, before we go into how the Ramban learns why the Torah uses his words in those days, the Sefornu actually answers this question. The Sefornu answers Rashi. He says a similar he says a similar explanation to Rashi, but he elaborates a little bit more on it. And according to his explanation, we can now understand why it would be possible to think that a Kohen of a lesser level, maybe something would be different. And the Sefornu says that the reason why the Torah says the Kohen of those days is because, as I pointed out before, when we first come to the place with the Bikurim, so what do? We before we even give the basket to the Kohen, we say to the Kohen, Higarti ayem laHashem Elokecha. I declare today to Hashem your God, I have come to this land. Now, as I said before, it's not only the Kohen's God, it's everybody's God. So when we say your God, what are we doing? So as I mentioned before, that is a very honorable way to speak to a person. When you're trying to speak honorably to a person, you refer to Hashem as your God, which means to say you have a unique relationship over many others with Hashem. You have a very unique relationship with him, and therefore that's the meaning of your God. Now, says the Sefornu, this kind of way of addressing a person and saying Hashem, your God, is reserved for very important people. It's reserved, the Sefornu says, for kings. It's reserved for prophets. You have to be a hush of a person. You've got to be a person on a high level that it should be seemingly appropriate to say Hashem, your God, because that means you have a very unique relationship with him. And therefore, a person might say like this: if the Kohen of the present is not on such a high spiritual level as the Kohen from before, then maybe these words of Hashem Elokecha, Hashem your God, are not appropriate. When you come to the point that the Kohen is not on such a high level, which we know that the Kohanim during the second Beis HaMikdash were not on a very high level, you might think that to them you don't say these words, Hashem Elokecha, Hashem your God. They're not deserving of that. Says the Sefornu the following. So Sefornu explains, I'm going to read you the words. And he says, nonetheless, when you bring him the bikurim, those first fruits, it's like bringing the gift to Hashem, Shubal HaKarka, the owner of the earth. Meaning, the bikurim is supposed to be presented to Hashem. How do you present the bikurim to Hashem? They're not offered on the altar. So how are they offered? How are they presented to Hashem? The answer is the Kohen is the representative of Hashem. So it comes out that this Kohen is doing a very important service for you. He is representing Hashem. He is the one who is making it that you're giving this gift to Hashem. If so, he deserves this kind of honorable addressing. You address him in an honorable way because even if he's not at the greatest level, he is performing now a very, very important service for you. He is representing Hashem and accepting your bikurim. If that is what he's doing, he's representing Hashem, then he deserves to be spoken in this very honorable way. Hashem, your God, you would have a unique relationship to Hashem. Because every Kohen has that. Because being a Kohen, he can represent Hashem here by the bikurim. Therefore, he deserves this respectful way of being spoken to. So if the question is, what difference does it make if a Kohen is on a high level or not? The answer is, it's not about what it's not, you're right. In essence, for what the Kohen does, it shouldn't make a difference. But because of what he does and represents and what he accomplishes in the Bikurim, no matter what spiritual level he's at, he is representing Hashem. He is accepting your Bikurim in place of Hashem. If that is what he's doing, he deserves to be addressed respectfully in this very respectful way of saying, Hashem, your God, the one you with the unique relationship, because of the Kohen he does. And that's manifesting itself in the fact that he represents Hashem now in accepting the Bikurim. Okay, so that would be an answer to Rashi. Now let's now focus on the Ramban. The Ramban himself, how does he answer the question of why the Torah says the Kohen of those days? Says the Ramban, and he cites the Sifri. Sifri is medrash. We call it more. It's a halachic medrash. It's not a medrash with stories or with ethical lessons. It's a medrash that derives laws from the words of the Torah. So the Sifri says that the point is like this. Let's say you have a Kohen, right? We know that a Kohen is not allowed to marry certain women, right? A Kohen may not marry a divorcee. Now, let's say a Kohen does marry a divorcee, and they have a child. Now, the child, the son of a Kohen, is typically a Kohen, right? But if the son of the Kohen is born from a woman that the Kohen is forbidden to marry, then that son is called a cholol. A cholol means he has been desecrated or emptied out from the kahuna. He is not a Kohen. His father's a Kohen. He may be born from a Kohen, but he can't be a Kohen because he's born from a forbidden marriage, from a marriage that a Kohen may not marry. Okay? So imagine the following scenario. You have this Kohen. He's been working for years in the Beis HaMikdash. And then one day somebody says, wait a minute. Isn't his mother a divorcee? I remember when they lived, I remember when they lived outside of Yerushalayim. I remember when they lived in a certain place, and the father got married to this woman he wasn't supposed to. And he's married to that woman. That means this man is a cholol. He's not supposed to be a Kohen. I don't know. But somehow or another, we find, somebody brings up the point, we investigate, and it's true. This Kohen, he was never a kosher Kohen. He's a cholol. Now, this Kohen has already been bringing sacrifices for people. Wow. He's been sprinkling blood. He's been accepting bikurim. Is everything like gone? Was everything a waste? And all those people got to rebring their karbanos? Have all the karbanos that this man has brought been invalid because he really wasn't the kosher Kohen? The answer is, I think it's a Gemara in Kedushin. The Gemara says, we have a source to learn that a Kohen, that if somebody was a Kohen, we thought he was a Kohen. As far as we knew, he was a Kohen. And he did the service. He brought the karbanos. And then we find out that he's not kosher. His karbanos count. They still count. They're still kosher. If we thought he was a Kohen, then the Torah says, after the fact, the karbanos are good. Says the Ramban, that's what the Torah here is telling us by Bikurim also. Torah is telling us by Bikurim also that if it comes out that the Kohen who you gave the Bikurim to, we find out that he never was a kosher Kohen, he was a Chalok because his mother was a divorcee, or whatever other woman a Kohen cannot marry, or whatever, okay, whatever the situation is, that the husband is a Kohen and the child produced from this marriage is not a Kohen, is not a kosher Kohen. The Torah is saying, Bayomim Haim, bring it to the Kohen of those days. If in those days you thought he was a Kohen in those days, that means you assumed he was a Kohen then, it's kosher. It's acceptable. So that's what the Ramban says from the Sifri. Why here the Torah says the words, Bayomim, that will be in those days. Those days means to say, if it was a Kohen in those days, the Bikurim is kosher. Okay, that's how the Ramban learns. So the Chassam Sefer asks the following question. As I mentioned before, we have already a source that tells us when you bring karbanos, when you bring sacrifices, that if you had this scenario that there was a Kohen bringing sacrifices, then you find out afterwards that he wasn't a kosher Kohen, the sacrifices are accepted. We have a source for that. If we already have a source for that, why do we need another source for Bikurim? We know that if a Kohen does a service, and we assumed he was a Kohen, we had no reason to think otherwise, and then it comes out afterwards that we find out that he wasn't a kosher Kohen, his service is good, his sacrifices are good. If we know it already there, why would the Torah have to again tell us something by the Bikurim that it applies by Bikurim too? Why should Bikurim be any different? One might even think on the contrary. Sacrifices, you actually bringing a sacrifice. And even then the Torah says, if this guy really was never kosher, his sacrifice is still accepted. Bikurim, that was we say koshkein, Bikurim all the more so, maybe.
Never go on the Mizbeach.
Doesn't go on the Mizbeach. So why would I say that? Why does the Torah need to tell me, especially by Bikurim, that this Kohen, who we assumed was kosher, now we found he never was, the Bikurim are still, the service, the mitzvah bringing the Bikurim and give it to the Kohen were fulfilled. Why do we need a special source here by Bikurim when we already know it by the sacrifices? So the Chassam Sefer answers like this, and it's an interesting idea, and the way I would say it is like this. Here it is. You bring the Bikurim to the Beis Hamikdash, and you give it to the Kohen, right? And eventually the Kohen puts it down near the Mizbeach, and after you finish doing the mitzvah, what happens to the Bikurim? The Kohen takes it and he eats it. So you could look at Bikurim as similar to Truma, right? We give a Kohen Truma. We have our produce that we have to give to the Kohen. There are certain things there are certain gifts the Torah says give to the Kohen. And that's what Bikurim is. Bikurim is a gift to the Kohen. Is that what Bikurim is? Or is actually Bikurim a carbon? Is Bikurim a type of carbon? It may not be offered on the Mizbeach, it may not be offered on the altar, but it's a type of carbon. You're not just giving it to the Kohen. You are actually, this is how you offer these Bikurim to Hashem. Like when you offer an animal to Hashem, when you bring Bikurim, it's also a carbon. It's also you're offering it to Hashem, which we mentioned something like that before. It's an offering to Hashem. If you think about it, right, it's much different than Truma because you got to bring it to the Beis Hamikdash. But Truma goes to any Kohen you want. These Bikurim, the Ramban points out, has to go to the Kohen whose turn is to serve in the Beis Hamikdash at that point of time. You can't just bring a Kohen along with you, your nephew who's a Kohen, and give him the Bikurim. No. The point is that the Kohanim, we know that the Kohanim are divided into 24 groups. They have their week in which they work in the Beis Hamikdash, and the Bikurim goes to the Kohen who is working in the Beis Hamikdash. Just like those Kohanim get from the sacrifices of that time that they're working then, if it's their week, so they get the Bikurim also. The Bikurim follow a pattern like a sacrifice. And they're put down in front of the Mizbeach, like there's some kind of connection there to the Mizbeach. Something's there. So therefore, if we see, so now like this. So if we look at the Bikurim as a carbon is something is offered to God, right? By a carbon, you typically have the blood on the altar, you have the parts that are burned on the altar. There is an offering that's offered to Hashem. Where is the offering, so to speak, done? Where is the offering done? What offering is being done to the Bikurim? By putting it down next to the Mizbeach, that's like offering it? The answer is, the offering of the Bikurim is the Kohen eating it. The Kohen eating it is in place of the altar, so to speak. An altar is where you offer, the Mizbeach is where you offer the other sacrifices. That's where you offer the sacrifices. The Bikurim, yes, they're put by the altar, but where are they offered? How are they given up to Hashem? The Kohen eats it. Says the Chassam Sofer like this. Again, there is definitely a way to go ahead and look at the actual sacrifices as in some way being on a higher level than the Bikurim because they're not actually offered on the Mizbeach. But the Chassam Sofer says like this. When you bring other karbanos, so what's the process? You bring an animal, you slaughter it. You catch the blood, you sprinkle the blood on the altar. You take the parts that have to be burnt on the altar, and it's burnt, depending on what kind of sacrifices it is. So the Chassam Sofer says, what is the Kohen's, how do we look at a Kohen when it comes to other sacrifices? The main point is for the blood to be on the altar. If you want to gain your atonement from the sacrifice you're bringing, whatever the sacrifice is meant to accomplish, it's accomplished when the blood gets onto the altar and when the parts are burned. That is what fulfills that's how you fulfill what you want to accomplish with the carbon. The Kohen, what is he? He's the shliach. He's the emissary. He's the one who gets it done. How does the blood get onto the altar? How do the fats get, how do the burned parts supposed to be burned? How do they get onto the altar? You can't do it. The Torah says the Kohen has to do it. But he's a shliach. He's an agent. You know, the discussion, he's the agent of the people, he's an agent of Hashem. But the point is, he's the man getting the job done. Something got to be accomplished. You got to get the blood on the altar. You got to get the parts to be burned. That is how the carbon is fulfilled. That's how you accomplish what you need to accomplish. And how's it going to get done? There's a middleman. There's a man who is going to get it done, who's going to get the blood on the altar, who's going to get the fats on the altar. But the main point is, for your atonement, what you want to accomplish with the carbon is for the blood to be there. You've got to get the blood onto the altar. You got to get the fats onto the altar. Who does it? Who brings it? Who gets it there? The Kohen. He's an agent. He's a middleman. So there, when the Torah says that even though we find out he was never kosher, we still say it's good. Okay, you know why? Because he's just a middleman. But by the Bikurim, the Kohen is more. The Kohen is more than just a middleman, just a man getting it there. He's like the Mizbeach. He's the altar. You're offering these fruits to Hashem through his eating. So he's more than just an agent. He's the altar. He's what accomplishes what the Bikurim needs to accomplish. You might think then, oh, for that he's really got to be kosher. He's always has to be kosher. Therefore, here the Torah tells us by Yamim Haim, no. The Kohen of those days, as long as you could assume he was kosher then, it works. And therefore, the Torah needs to speak it out by Bikurim and can't just rely on what the Torah tells us by sacrifices.
What was the last sentence you said? As long as you knew he was kosher. But
when
I'm afraid we found out he wasn't kosher.
Right, but at the time, he was kosher.
You thought he was?
Yeah, so that's the whole point. The Torah says it still works. That's the whole point. That's the whole chiddush here. And that's learned from Sukkim. That's the whole point. He was never, at the end, you verify he was never kosher.
This is Chassam Sofer's defense of the Ramban?
This is how he answers his kasha on the Ramban. The fact that we have a drasha by Karbonis that a Kohen who comes out never being kosher, his sacrifice still work, that's a Gemara. Yeah. Excuse me? We have a source for that. The Sifri says, we have by Bikurim, the source are these words, by Yamim Haim. The Sifri says it here by these words, by Bikurim. The Chassam Sofer wants to know, and that's how the Ramban explained the Psukim here, not like Rashi. So the Chassam Sofer wants to know, but why do I need another source by Bikurim? Why can't I just use the source by the Mizbeach? Says the Chassam Sofer, because by Bikurim, the Kohen is actually acting in a greater role than he is by a carbon. And therefore, we need our own source to say that even though it comes out he was never kosher, if at that time we thought he was kosher, we assumed he was kosher, then it works. Just want to conclude one last thought over here. And that is that the Parsha begins with the mitzvah Bikurim, right? The end of last week's Parsha Kiteitzei. What did the end of last week's Parsha talk about? Amalek, right? That's where the Torah tells us to remember what Amalek did. So although Rashi doesn't comment on this, and very often Rashi does comment on this kind of question, but here he doesn't. What's the connection between the two? Why do we have Amalek and then Bikurim? What's the connection? Is it just random? Is there some reason? Is there some kind of connection between them? Very often we do find an idea of smichas. When two things are next to each other, it means to bring out something. Now, Rashi here doesn't address it. I don't know if any of Midrashim address it, but you have commentaries that do address it. And therefore, we can offer an answer to that also. Now, to go a step back in last week's Parsha, before Amalek, what does the Torah talk about?
Weights and measures.
Weights and measures. There, Rashi tells us, or the Medrash tells us, there's a connection between the two. Why does the Torah talk about false measures and false weights and then talk about Amalek? The answer is, because if you cheat people with your measures and your weights, that's a reason for the enemy like Amalek to come and attack you. That's what Rashi brings down. Now, it's not like that's what they were doing the first time Amalek attacked them, but the idea is that an enemy will come after you like Amalek if you're not honest with your weights and measures. Okay. What's the connection? What's the connection between the two?
No connection.
So it has to be, right? So the connection is like this. The connection possibly is that when what we know that Amalek, it says by Amalek in the last week's Parsha, Ashakar Chabaderech. Literally translated, he happened on you on the way. You met up with him on the way. There Rashi brings down, Karach comes the word cold, he cooled you down. Everyone is afraid of you, and he cooled you down because he attacked you. He showed you were vulnerable. Others learn that the word karcha is related to the word mikra, which means happenstance, coincidence. The midah, the trait of Amalek, and what makes Amalek so evil, and why we have to destroy Amalek, is because Amalek contaminated the world with the belief that Hashem does not run the world. Now, all those miracles that you saw, don't get too caught up on it. Don't let it bother you too much. Mikra. It just happened. It happened. How did it happen? I don't know what happened. It's not Hashem. Hashem doesn't run the world. Now, whether it is Hashem, not Hashem, that's a different story. How far does Amalek go in his beliefs? But one thing, though, the world is independent from Hashem. And that's why he attacked the Jewish people. Everybody else saw the miracles Hashem did. They wouldn't touch the Jewish people. And Amalek came anyway, because his point, he wanted to make a point. His point was, no, the world is not subservient to Hashem. Subservient to man. Might Rick's right. Survival of the fittest. That's how the world goes. Now, many commentaries say that about Amalek. Now, with that, we can make a connection between false weights and measures. Why do you cheat people? Especially, we're not even talking about there's some money there, it's tempting, you break into someone's house. You're cheating in your weights and scales. That means you're being very deliberate in what you're doing. Being very deliberate. Why are you doing that? Because you think,
nobody sees.
Right, that's how you get away with it. But why are you driven to do that? Just because nobody sees? It has to do with the fact that very often a person thinks, especially in business, it's hard to make a living. It's a jungle out there, lots of competition. I need to do whatever it takes to make the buck. That shows a lack in your belief that Hashem runs the world. Because if Hashem runs the world, then you don't need to cheat people. You need to steal people. You get what Hashem gives you. If you don't do that, if you show that you don't live with that by cheating with your weights and with your scales and your measures, you know what the result of that is? An Amalek. You'll be attacked by an enemy that says to you, I don't care about who you are. I don't care what your history is about. I can attack you anyway. You'll be attacked by an enemy that shows that disregard for the belief in Hashem running the world. If we say that, we can now make a connection to Bikurim. Because what's Bikurim about? Bikurim is about Hakaras HaTov. It's about our gratitude to Hashem. It's where we recognize that everything comes from Hashem. So that's what follows Amalek. After the Torah tells us, remember Amalek, remember to destroy Amalek, because of the contamination, the spiritual contamination that the world is filled with by Amalek, who tries to spread throughout the world that Hashem doesn't run the world. We bring Bikurim. We show the world, we show ourselves in the world, we thank Hashem for the fruits of the land. No matter how hard we worked at it and how much effort we put in, at the end of the day, we recognize it's Hashem. And therefore, it all works together. You don't. If you're cheating if you're cheating people with your measures, that shows you don't believe Hashem. You don't live with the fact that Hashem runs the world. That's what Amalek was trying to teach everyone. And by Bikurim, we show it's not that way. How we live with the fact that everything we have comes from Hashem, and we thank Him for it. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you for listening.
The story about not kosher